Imagine this. You spend years believing that kindness is your greatest strength, only to discover that the world has mistaken it for permission. Every apology you accepted became another invitation to be wounded. Every silence you offered became another space for someone else's voice to dominate. Every sacrifice was interpreted not as love, but as limitless availability. Then one day, without warning, something changes, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. The people around you call it coldness. Carl Jung might have called it the beginning of individuation. There is a dangerous illusion that narcissists carry deep within the architecture of their psyche. They believe every person has a breaking point beyond which they simply surrender. Their confidence is built upon repetition. Manipulate enough times, and resistance fades. Shame someone long enough, and eventually they question themselves instead of their tormentor. Reward obedience just enough, and dependency quietly replaces dignity. This strategy often works. Until it doesn't. Because there exists another psychological journey, one that the narcissistic personality rarely anticipates. It is the journey of the empath who has suffered beyond imagination. Not the empath who still hopes to be understood. Not the empath who still explains. Not the empath desperately trying to rescue another wounded soul. But the one who has finally encountered her own shadow. Jung warned that everything unconscious eventually seeks expression. For years, the empath buries anger beneath compassion. She buries disappointment beneath forgiveness. She buries exhaustion beneath responsibility. She tells herself that love requires patience. That understanding heals everything. That if she simply becomes more gentle, more available, more forgiving, eventually harmony will arrive. But harmony built upon self-erasure is merely another prison. The unconscious keeps count, even when consciousness refuses to. Every betrayal enters the body. Every humiliation settles into memory. Every invisible wound waits. Modern trauma psychology confirms something Jung understood intuitively long before neuroscience could explain it. Emotional pain is not forgotten simply because someone decides to move on. It becomes encoded within nervous systems, behavioral patterns, expectations, and unconscious defenses. A woman may smile while carrying decades of invisible injuries that no one else notices. The narcissist mistakes this silence for weakness. That becomes the greatest miscalculation of all. Because silence is not always surrender. Sometimes silence is incubation. Consider nature itself. A volcano appears peaceful for centuries. Mountains seem motionless. The deepest rivers reveal almost nothing from their surfaces. Transformation rarely announces itself before it arrives. The empath's greatest evolution begins in hidden places. At first, nothing seems different. She still answers messages. She still goes to family gatherings. She still listens. She still appears kind. But internally, the architecture has begun shifting. The old identity is dying. Not because she suddenly hates people, but because she finally questions a devastating belief she carried since childhood. Perhaps love was never supposed to cost this much. This question terrifies the unconscious because it threatens every role she has ever performed. The rescuer, the peacemaker, the emotional caretaker, the invisible daughter, the endlessly understanding wife, the forgiving friend. These identities once provided belonging. They protected her from abandonment. They convinced her that being indispensable meant being loved. Yet Jung insisted that the greatest danger is identifying with the persona rather than the authentic self. The persona smiles. The self remembers. The persona apologizes. The self begins asking uncomfortable questions. Who benefits from your endless forgiveness? Who profits from your inability to say no? Who becomes stronger every time you abandon yourself? These questions awaken something ancient. Something many cultures have misunderstood. Anger. Healthy anger is not hatred. Healthy anger is the immune system of the soul. Stoic philosophers often emphasize that emotions themselves are not enemies. Epictetus taught that suffering emerges from distorted judgments rather than reality itself. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself that dignity could never truly be stolen without one's participation. The fed-up empath slowly discovers the same truth. The problem was never feeling deeply. The problem was directing all compassion outward while starving herself inwardly. She begins noticing patterns she once ignored. The friend who only calls during crises. The partner who apologizes without changing. The family member who demands loyalty while offering none. The coworker who mistakes generosity for obligation. The narcissist depends upon predictability. He knows exactly which guilt to activate. Exactly which childhood wound to touch. Exactly which fear of rejection to awaken. His power has never been magic. It has always depended upon unconscious cooperation. Projection becomes his primary weapon. Jung described projection as placing one's rejected qualities onto another person. The narcissist cannot tolerate shame, so he assigns it elsewhere. He cannot face his own inadequacy, so someone else must become inadequate. He cannot accept responsibility, so another person must become responsible for his emotional chaos. The empath accepts these projections because empathy naturally seeks understanding. She asks herself what she did wrong. She examines every conversation. She apologizes for emotions that were never hers. She carries burdens she never created. For years, this dance continues. But every projection accepted also plants a seed. Eventually, the unconscious grows tired of carrying another person's darkness. The shadow begins knocking. Not to destroy her. To rescue her. The shadow is often misunderstood as something evil. Jung never described it that way. The shadow contains everything consciousness refuses to acknowledge. Sometimes that includes aggression, sometimes selfishness, sometimes ambition, sometimes boundaries. Sometimes the shadow contains the exact strength required for survival. Imagine a woman who spent 40 years believing good women never disappoint anyone. What happens when she finally discovers disappointment is unavoidable? Someone will always be unhappy. The only remaining question is who. Will it always be her? Or will she finally allow someone else to experience the discomfort they have spent decades assigning to her? The answer changes everything. She begins speaking fewer words. Not because she fears confrontation. Because explanation no longer feels necessary. She stops chasing misunderstandings. She stops proving intentions. She stops defending boundaries that should never have required defense. To outside observers, she appears different. Some call her distant. Others call her selfish. The narcissist calls her cruel. But none of these descriptions reach her anymore because something far more significant has occurred. She has withdrawn her unconscious agreement. That invisible contract she signed in childhood, the one promising to earn love through endless sacrifice, has quietly expired. The narcissist senses this before anyone else. He notices the delayed response. The absence of emotional panic. The refusal to argue. The unsettling calm behind her eyes. He mistakes it for another temporary phase. He believes another cycle of guilt, affection, criticism, and manipulation will restore the familiar balance. He has no idea that the woman standing before him is no longer negotiating from the wounded child he once controlled. Somewhere deep within her psyche, another archetype has awakened. Not the caretaker. Not the victim. Not even the survivor. Something infinitely more difficult to manipulate. A woman beginning to remember who she was before fear taught her to become small. The transformation remains almost invisible to those who only understand human behavior through appearances. Nothing spectacular announces its arrival. There is no dramatic declaration. No theatrical confrontation. No desperate attempt to prove a point. The fed-up empath simply begins removing her energy from places where it has never been honored. This quiet withdrawal is precisely what unsettles the narcissistic personality. Because narcissism survives not on love, but on emotional supply. For years, he believed he understood her completely. He knew which compliments would soften her resolve. He knew which accusations would provoke guilt. He knew how to alternate warmth with distance until she questioned her own reality. Every cycle strengthened his confidence because every cycle ended the same way. She returned. She apologized. She explained. She forgave. But now something profoundly unfamiliar unfolds before him. She listens without defending herself. She hears accusations without absorbing them. She watches emotional storms without entering them. It feels unnatural to him because his psychological weapons have always required participation. Manipulation is never a solitary act. It demands an unconscious partner willing to carry projected shame, confusion, or responsibility. Without that participation, the entire structure begins collapsing under its own weight. Jung understood that projection eventually fails when consciousness expands. The more aware a person becomes of their own unconscious patterns, the less susceptible they are to carrying another person's shadow. It is not because they become less compassionate. It is because compassion finally includes themselves. This is where many people misunderstand the awakened empath. They imagine she has become hard. She has not. She has become whole. Wholeness often appears frightening to those who benefited from your fragmentation. Consider how children are taught to earn affection. Many learn that love follows achievement. Others discover that peace depends upon silence. Some realize their role is to comfort adults instead of being comforted themselves. These lessons do not disappear with age. They become unconscious blueprints governing adult relationships. A little girl who learned to anticipate everyone's emotional needs often becomes the woman who apologizes for existing. A daughter who became her mother's therapist often marries a man who expects emotional caretaking without reciprocity. The pattern feels familiar. Familiarity disguises itself as love. Modern attachment psychology echoes what Jung observed through symbolism and archetypes. We unconsciously recreate emotional landscapes that resemble childhood, hoping this time the ending will change. The wounded psyche keeps returning to similar people because it believes mastery lies one more sacrifice away. But healing begins the moment repetition is recognized. Not when another person changes. When you stop mistaking familiarity for destiny. The empath eventually notices that every relationship demanding her disappearance follows the same invisible script. She must remain patient. She must remain understanding. She must remain available. She must never become inconvenient. The moment she expresses disappointment, she becomes too emotional. The moment she asks for respect, she becomes difficult. The moment she establishes boundaries, she becomes selfish. Notice how language itself becomes a psychological prison. The narcissistic personality rarely says, "I want control." Instead, control disguises itself as concern. "You've changed. I miss the old you. You're overreacting. You used to care." These statements are carefully designed to awaken the abandoned child still living inside the empath. They seek not dialogue but regression. If she returns emotionally to childhood, she once again becomes manageable. Yet something astonishing happens after enough shadow work. The child is no longer alone. Within Jungian psychology, individuation is not the destruction of earlier parts of the psyche. It is their integration. The wounded child does not disappear. She is finally protected by the mature self. Imagine standing before someone who once terrified you. Their voice is unchanged. Their expressions are identical. Their strategies remain painfully familiar. Yet your body no longer trembles. Why? Because fear was never only about them. It was also about standing alone. Now you are no longer alone within yourself. The conscious and unconscious have begun speaking to one another. The frightened child finally feels the presence of an inner protector. This is why boundaries feel so different after genuine healing. Before, they were negotiations. Now, they are simply reality. The narcissist notices this shift immediately. Although he cannot explain it, he senses that emotional hooks no longer find their target. Guilt falls to the ground unanswered. Criticism echoes without producing shame. Praise no longer purchases obedience. His confusion gradually transforms into desperation. At first, he intensifies familiar tactics. More charm. More promises. More tears. More accusations. When those fail, something darker often emerges. Contempt. Mockery. Character assassination. Why? Because projection becomes increasingly unstable when denied. The emotions he once deposited inside her remain trapped within himself. He begins experiencing the anxiety, insecurity, and emptiness he spent years outsourcing. Jung warned that what remains unconscious directs life while appearing to come from outside. The narcissist experiences growing chaos because his own shadow has nowhere left to hide. Ironically, the empath's departure forces him closer to himself than he has ever been. Whether he accepts that invitation is another matter entirely. Most do not. Because facing the shadow demands humility. And humility threatens the false self upon which narcissism depends. Meanwhile, the empath enters unfamiliar territory. Freedom is beautiful. Freedom is also terrifying. For years, her identity revolved around solving everyone else's emotional crises. Without that constant responsibility, silence initially feels uncomfortable. Who is she when no one needs rescuing? Who is she when her value is no longer measured by sacrifice? These questions cannot be answered overnight. They require grief. Because healing is not only gaining something new. It is mourning the person you had to become in order to survive. She mourns the years spent chasing unavailable love. She mourns friendships built upon unequal devotion. She mourns versions of herself that believed endurance was proof of worthiness. There are evenings when loneliness whispers that returning would be easier. The psyche always romanticizes familiar suffering before embracing unfamiliar peace. Marcus Aurelius understood this tendency. Human beings often cling to what hurts because predictability feels safer than uncertainty. Yet courage has never meant the absence of fear. Courage is choosing alignment despite fear. The fed-up empath slowly realizes that peace feels strange simply because chaos once felt like home. She begins creating entirely different relationships. People who celebrate honesty instead of punishing it. People who apologize without needing persuasion. People who ask instead of assuming. People whose love does not require self-abandonment. For perhaps the first time in her life, reciprocity feels almost suspicious. She waits for manipulation. It never comes. She waits for affection to become conditional. It remains steady. Her nervous system, conditioned by years of emotional unpredictability, requires time to believe safety is real. Trauma does not vanish because circumstances improve. The body learns slowly. But it does learn. Each respectful conversation rewrites expectation. Each honored boundary reshapes identity. Each moment of peace becomes evidence that love and anxiety were never meant to be inseparable. And somewhere, watching from a distance, the narcissist discovers a truth he never imagined possible. The woman he believed he had permanently defined has become someone completely beyond his psychological reach. Distance does something that constant proximity never can. It allows hidden patterns to emerge with startling clarity. What once felt like isolated disappointments now forms a single unmistakable design. The empath no longer sees separate arguments, separate betrayals, or separate moments of disrespect. She sees the architecture beneath them all. She recognizes the invisible thread that connected every apology that was never followed by change. Every promise that dissolved under pressure. Every moment when her compassion became another tool used against her. This is one of the most unsettling moments in psychological awakening. Not because the truth is cruel. Because it is simple. The complexity was never in understanding what happened. The complexity was in accepting it. Jung believed that consciousness expands through confrontation with reality, not escape from it. Reality rarely announces itself with dramatic revelations. More often, it whispers through repetition, the same wound appearing in different faces. The same emotional exhaustion following different conversations. The same loneliness existing even while surrounded by people. The unconscious speaks through patterns. The conscious mind often dismisses them as coincidence. Until one day, coincidence becomes impossible to defend. You may recognize this moment in your own life. Perhaps there was a conversation that should have been ordinary but left you feeling strangely invisible. Perhaps there was a relationship in which you kept becoming smaller while convincing yourself you were becoming more loving. Perhaps there was a moment when you realized that the person constantly demanding understanding had never once attempted to understand you. These realizations do not create awakening. They reveal it. The empath begins noticing something even more profound. She was never difficult to love. She was simply surrounded by people who confused access with ownership. There is a profound psychological difference between intimacy and entitlement. Healthy love approaches another person with reverence. It recognizes mystery. It accepts that another soul can never be completely possessed. The narcissistic psyche cannot tolerate mystery. It seeks certainty through control. If she smiles, it wants credit. If she succeeds, it wants ownership. If she leaves, it wants revenge. Control becomes a substitute for connection because authentic connection requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires facing one's own incompleteness. The false self constructed by narcissism cannot survive that encounter. This is why genuine independence often appears threatening. Not because independence attacks anyone. Because it exposes dependency disguised as dominance. The fed-up empath no longer argues about reality. This may seem insignificant from the outside, yet psychologically it represents an extraordinary evolution. Earlier in life, every accusation demanded a defense. Every misunderstanding demanded clarification. Every distorted narrative demanded correction. She believed truth required persuasion. Now she understands something Marcus Aurelius practiced relentlessly. Reality does not become more true because another person agrees with it. Silence is no longer surrender. It is discernment. She begins preserving her energy for conversations capable of producing growth rather than endless circular conflict. The narcissist interprets this silence as arrogance. Friends unfamiliar with her transformation may interpret it as emotional distance. Even family members sometimes wonder why she has become less available. But what they witness is not withdrawal from love. It is withdrawal from unconscious obligation. For years, obligation masqueraded as virtue. She answered every late-night crisis. She absorbed every emotional explosion. She forgave every repeated betrayal. She believed saying yes made her compassionate. Now she asks a question that once seemed almost forbidden. Does this relationship nourish both souls, or only one? The answer changes everything. Psychologically, this marks the movement from the archetype of the martyr toward the archetype of the sovereign. The martyr believes suffering creates value. The sovereign understands value exists before suffering begins. This distinction transforms every relationship. The sovereign does not seek superiority. She seeks congruence. Her words match her actions. Her compassion includes accountability. Her generosity no longer requires self-erasure. There is remarkable power in someone who no longer needs to convince others of their goodness. Such a person becomes psychologically unpredictable to manipulative personalities. Why? Because manipulation depends upon identity. If someone believes they must always be seen as kind, they can be manipulated through accusations of cruelty. If someone believes they must always be perceived as loyal, they can be manipulated through accusations of betrayal. If someone believes they must never disappoint anyone, disappointment becomes a weapon. But what happens when identity shifts? What happens when kindness includes saying no? When loyalty includes loyalty to oneself? When compassion refuses to participate in abuse? The old psychological keys no longer fit the new locks. Jung often emphasized that the goal is not perfection but wholeness. Wholeness includes tenderness. Wholeness also includes strength. Wholeness allows love without losing discernment. Perhaps the greatest misconception surrounding empaths is that they are defined by endless softness. In truth, mature empathy possesses remarkable precision. It no longer confuses understanding with permission. It no longer mistakes potential for reality. It no longer sacrifices the present in service of imagined futures. Many women spend years loving who someone could become. The individuated woman responds to who someone consistently chooses to be. That shift alone changes destiny. Because behavior, not promises, reveals character. Patterns, not isolated moments, reveal intention. Consistency, not intensity, reveals love. There comes a quiet afternoon when the empath realizes she has stopped checking whether someone else approves of her decisions. She buys what she genuinely likes rather than what earns admiration. She speaks because her voice deserves existence, not because it guarantees acceptance. She rests without apologizing. She declines invitations without inventing excuses. These ordinary acts are psychologically revolutionary. Every authentic choice strengthens the self. Every boundary honored weakens the old persona that survived through pleasing others. Neuroscience describes this as creating new pathways through repetition. Jung described it symbolically as the birth of a more integrated personality. Different language. The same profound transformation. And something unexpected begins happening. The people capable of authentic love move closer. Not because she has become easier. Because she has become real. Healthy individuals are not threatened by boundaries. They are relieved by them. Boundaries remove confusion. They create trust. They reveal where one soul ends and another begins. Only those invested in crossing those lines protest their existence. The narcissist cannot comprehend this shift. He watches others respecting the woman he once convinced was impossible to respect. He watches her laughter return without his permission. He watches her confidence deepen without his validation. Most unsettling of all, he watches her become emotionally unavailable to manipulation while remaining emotionally available to genuine connection. That contradiction makes no sense to him. Because he never understood that her empathy was never the weakness. Her lack of boundaries was. Now the boundaries stand where fear once lived. Now discernment stands where guilt once ruled. Now self-respect stands where self-doubt once quietly whispered. The woman before him is still deeply compassionate. She simply no longer mistakes compassion for captivity. There comes a moment in every profound psychological transformation when the battle is no longer with another person. The arguments have faded. The manipulation has lost its grip. The endless need to explain has dissolved into silence. Yet one final confrontation remains. And it takes place entirely within the soul. It is the meeting between the woman she was taught to become and the woman she was always meant to be. Jung believed that the greatest encounters are not between two people, but between consciousness and the unconscious. The deepest revolution is invisible because it unfolds behind the eyes, beneath language, in the quiet territory where identity is rewritten. The fed-up empath eventually discovers that the narcissist was never the only voice living inside her. There was another. A softer voice. One that sounded strangely familiar. It whispered that saying no was selfish. It insisted that conflict meant failure. It warned that loneliness was worse than disrespect. It begged her to earn love one more time. For years she believed this voice was wisdom. Only later did she realize it was fear wearing the mask of morality. This is how old wounds survive. They disguise themselves as virtues. People applaud the woman who never complains. They admire the woman who always forgives. They celebrate the woman who sacrifices everything for everyone else. Rarely do they ask what those sacrifices have cost her. Rarely do they notice the dreams postponed. The boundaries abandoned. The identity forgotten. The psyche always collects unpaid debts. Every time authenticity is exchanged for approval, the unconscious remembers. Every time truth is swallowed to preserve peace, something sacred retreats a little further into the shadows. Yet the shadow was never waiting to punish her. It was waiting to return what she had lost. The anger she feared became courage. The grief she avoided became compassion. The loneliness she resisted became solitude. The silence she dreaded became clarity. This is the extraordinary paradox Jung understood so deeply. The emotions we spend our lives trying to escape often carry the exact medicine we require. The fed-up empath no longer runs from discomfort. She listens to it. Discomfort becomes information. If her body tightens around someone, she pays attention. If peace disappears in a relationship, she investigates rather than excuses it. If respect repeatedly vanishes after promises are made, she believes behavior instead of fantasy. This is not cynicism. It is consciousness. You may notice that truly healed people are surprisingly calm. Not because life stopped testing them, Because they stopped negotiating with reality. They no longer ask, "How can I make this person love me?" They ask, "Does this relationship allow me to remain myself?" That single question changes every decision that follows. Seneca wrote that the greatest slavery is living under the opinions of others. Few forms of slavery are more subtle than emotional dependence upon external validation. The narcissist depends on admiration. The wounded empath depends on acceptance. Both remain emotionally imprisoned, although their prisons look different. Healing breaks both cages. The individuated woman no longer measures her worth through applause or rejection. Compliments are appreciated but not required. Criticism is considered but not worshipped. She becomes internally anchored. This is why she seems almost impossible to manipulate. Manipulation requires an external lever. But where is the lever when self-worth comes from within? Threaten abandonment. She chooses peace over panic. Offer conditional affection. She recognizes the bargain and declines. Attempt guilt. She examines it instead of automatically accepting it. Rewrite history. She trusts lived experience more than emotional persuasion. The narcissist often mistakes this transformation for emotional numbness. He cannot comprehend that serenity and indifference are entirely different states. She still feels deeply. Perhaps more deeply than ever before. She cries without shame. She loves without pretending. She grieves without collapsing. She celebrates without seeking permission. Emotion is no longer her enemy. Emotion is no longer her master. It has become her companion. Modern psychology often speaks of emotional regulation. Jung might describe it differently. He would speak of integration. The heart and the mind no longer compete. The conscious self no longer fears the unconscious. The shadow is no longer an exile. It has become an ally. The remarkable consequence of this integration is not merely healthier relationships. It is a different experience of life itself. Ordinary mornings begin feeling extraordinary. Coffee tastes richer when consumed without anxiety. Laughter arrives more easily when it is not interrupted by hypervigilance. Rest becomes possible when survival is no longer the primary occupation of the nervous system. Freedom is rarely dramatic. More often, it is astonishingly quiet. It is walking through an entire day without rehearsing conversations that never happened. It is sleeping through the night because your mind is no longer searching for hidden danger. It is hearing your own thoughts more clearly than the opinions surrounding you. Perhaps this is the greatest revenge, although revenge is no longer the correct word. It is transcendence. The narcissist expected endless war. Instead, he encountered absence. Not physical absence alone. Psychological absence. The emotional doorway through which he once entered has been permanently closed. Not locked out of hatred. Closed through healing. That difference matters. Hatred still binds two people together. Healing releases both. Whether the narcissist chooses freedom is beyond her control. Whether he confronts his own shadow is his responsibility. She no longer mistakes another person's healing for her assignment. This realization feels almost sacred. She was never placed on this earth to carry souls unwilling to carry themselves. She was never created to become the emotional home for people who repeatedly burned down every house they entered. She was never meant to disappear so that someone else could feel important. She was meant to become whole. And wholeness radiates in ways that require no performance. There is no desperate need to impress. No hunger to be chosen. No exhausting chase after unavailable affection. There is only presence. Only dignity. Only the quiet confidence of someone who finally belongs to herself. The world often misunderstands women like this. Some call them intimidating. Others call them detached. But those capable of genuine love recognize something entirely different. They recognize peace. Not the fragile peace purchased through silence. The enduring peace born from truth. This woman still opens her heart. She simply no longer abandons herself while doing so. She still believes in love. She simply refuses to confuse love with suffering. She still extends compassion. She simply remembers that compassion without discernment becomes self-destruction. The fed-up empath was never dangerous because she became cruel. She became dangerous because she became impossible to control. And there is nothing more unsettling to those who survive through manipulation than a woman who has made peace with herself. Because a woman who has embraced her shadow no longer fears losing people who only loved her mask. She walks forward carrying neither bitterness nor regret, but wisdom. She no longer searches for permission to exist. She no longer bargains for dignity. She no longer waits for someone else to declare her worthy. She has already made that decision. A woman who knows her worth does not pursue, she chooses.